Welcome to People Love Process. The creative process at times can get a little scary. Fear of failure, fear that you might not be able to pull off a certain style, etc. This is normal and should be expected. For this movie, our theme is literally scary, and our theme is horror. So let's dive into this monstrous project and help an independent podcast improve its identity so they can communicate more effectively with the audience who loves this genre. This is going to be a fun one. Let's get started. Now, over the years, I've created a lot of skull art. I never really set out to do it on purpose. It's just one project would come up and somebody would ask me to do this. Another project would come up and somebody would ask me to do that. So I never planned it, but it's always fun. And this is just a short sampling of a lot of skull art I've done. I could fill up 2 or 3 more pages with other skull art, but this gives you an idea that it's a theme I've done a lot over the years for various projects. This specific project, a podcast, this was their cover graphic that they use for their podcast, which is square format. That shows up on iTunes and other platforms that support podcasting that you can subscribe to. So this is what they're doing, and I think I can improve on this. This is why they hired me to take their idea, and the name's great, Grave Discussions. It goes with the genre. And this is where I'll start sketching. Now, I like to sketch on notepads. So here's an example of a sketch I did on a notepad. And this is just crude using a pen. I'm thinking about the structure of their new cover. I know they want a skull. They don't want a human skull, even though I doodled one out here. They wanted it more monstrous. And so I'm thinking about the head of that, probably have some horns on it, and I want it to be bat wings. But I'm just working out in thumbnail form. How could I structure that layout? Thinking about some of the fonts I might use. And this tends to be how I start a project, as I've taken in all the information and just figuring out what direction I'm going to go. Now, the theme of a skull is something I've done a lot over the years, and I can sit down and just doodle out a skull pretty well just out of my head because I've done it so much. But it doesn't matter if you're doing something more novel, something more realistic, or in this case, something kind of graphic and stylized, flat-based artwork. I want to look at reference to help me capture the essence of certain things. So this image in the bottom left here is a taxidermied bear, but I love the teeth. So that's giving me insight of how I could handle the teeth. And if you look at these fake teeth up here, if you dress up like Dracula, that's what these props are for. I'll look at sculptures like this one and this one, just because I like the structure of how they formed and shaped things. I'll look at realistically proportioned skulls. I'll look at how they handled the teeth. I know I want to combine it with wings, and that's kind of what this one did. And mine's going to be similar to this in that respect, but I also want to have wings on it. I don't want bird wings, I want bat wings. So I'm looking at how the bat wings are structured on a real bat. Is it realistic that I'm going to pull off? Well, no, it mimics realism in terms of some of the proportions, but the styling is far more graphic than realistic, and that's fine. All of this is going to help me capture those cues and be able to draw it better. Now, ultimately, my refined drawing look like this. I draw with a mechanical pencil when I'm working out a final refined drawing. And in this case, since I've done a skull so much, this one came pretty easy. I only drew half of it because I'm going to use symmetry to build both sides and reflect it in Illustrator. And I drew the wings separate from the skull itself. This is where I'll turn to my flatbed scanner, scan that drawing in, bring it into Photoshop, and adjust it. Once I have that adjusted and set up, I can compose the wing with the skull like this, flip it over, and then I have the refined sketch I can use in Illustrator. If I turn on this layer, you can see I already have this set to 15%, but I'll place it in Illustrator at 100% like this. So you can see how I tested this in Photoshop to make sure that reflection looks well. There's times where I've done it before and I go, oh, that looks a little too thin, or that looks a little wonky. Maybe it needs to be a bit wider. And I'll make those adjustments in Photoshop. If I think I have to redraw something, I'll redraw it and scan it back in and test it again. Once I have a refined sketch, I place it into Illustrator after I've scanned it in and did all the work in Photoshop. And again, we'll go ahead and set this for 15%, and I'll lock this layer because we're going to build above it. Now, the first thing I always start with when I'm creating is the simplest shapes. If we zoom in on just this skull, you can see I've dropped a guide down defining the middle of this overall design, but I've just used the ellipse tool up here to create a giant oval and these elliptical shapes to create the detailing here. And this makes the process go a lot easier. I'm going to go ahead and take this shape and this shape, and using Pathfinder, let's click on Pathfinder down here. We're going to go minus front just to cut out that shape like this to form that edge of what is the cheek, I guess, of the skull. And then let's go and zoom in a little bit, because now that we've done that, we'll go back to the ellipse tool, and all I'm going to do is create another elliptical shape like this to get that inset here. And one thing I do is I'll rotate it so this anchor point will get fused in with the other shapes, and it doesn't put an anchor point on the path that leads behind. This is better shown. So with this selected, I'm going to select the giant oval, and I'm going to go minus front again, and that creates this little cut-in shape. And that's the kind of thing I'll do to now combine all these shapes, and I'll go ahead and go unite to unite all those shapes. I'll create a throwaway shape. This is where I have smart guides turned on, Command U to turn it on and off. And it depends on what you're doing. If you're using the pin tool, you might want to turn it on and off as you're building, because it'll want to snap to anchors, it'll want to snap to paths, and sometimes you don't want that. But in this case, we do, because I'm going to create a throwaway shape, this giant rectangle, for no other purpose than to edit the other shape just so it's ready to reflect. So that's how I build that shape. A lot easier than trying to use the pin tool to create these curves. You get more precision using shape building techniques. That said, I'll continue to use this principle where I'll create another oval shape to create this. This will be the inset here. So I'll select both of these. I'll go unite. I might even come in here, pull this down like that. This is sitting on top of our original shape. I'll minus front, and I'll keep working at those details, but it helps to think like that to make the process easier. I might even go in like this and create a throwaway shape like this, snapping it to the guide like that, and then select all of these ultimately, because I need to create this edge on the teeth, so I need part of the shape to be there, and I'll create something like that. So this is because I'm going to go in and build these elements on the teeth, and I want to show you how you can think when you create. This tooth is mostly circular on the bottom, so it's easier to create a shape like this. Let's go ahead and check what the stroke is here. I'm going to go even thinner so you can see it easier, kind of like that. This is where I'll take this shape, I'll select this anchor point here, and I'll just move it up to where it comes to a point here, like that. Now this is where I'll go up to the top here, and in Illustrator by default, you have this will convert it to a corner. This will convert it to a smooth. Right now it's a smooth. I want it to be a corner, so I'm going to click that, and you can see what that does here. The only thing I don't like about that is it gets rid of the handles, and I want the handles, so I'm going to undo that, and I'm just going to isolate this, go to the anchor point tool, and then I'm just going to pull one side, and that's going to break it for me, but it still retains the other anchor. And this is where I'll just go in and I'll just select the handles, and I'll control this Bezier curve to get what I want. Now, sometimes you can select the entire shape, and I can pull this in from the right if I wanted it to be more like this. Maybe this one goes down a little bit, and you can adjust it to get the final shape you want. But that's how I build these teeth. It's just a lot faster without having used the pin tool to start and try to create all of it from scratch. just think in shapes, deduce down from complex shapes to simplified shapes, and your life is going to be easier when you build your vector art. Now, if I turn on all of these teeth here, you can see ultimately I kept my original tooth a little wider like that, but that's fine. All we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and select, let's see, we're going to go ahead and select this tooth here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to offset this. And this is how I'm going to create all the detail here. Now, let's go ahead and turn on this layer here. You can see I've offset these already. So all we're going to do is do it on this last one here. So we'll go to Object, we'll go to Path, we'll go to Offset Path. And this is way too big. We don't want it at 10. I was probably working on something else when I last used this. We'll do 3, and you can check it. I think that looks good. That gives us what we need. Notice I have mitering on, and mitering will do this when it comes to a point. So if you're wanting this to come to a point, you'd want to leave mitering on. If you turn it to round, it'll do this at the bottom. And this is usually what I do because I never like how it miters with a sharp point. I'll just go in and edit it if I don't like that. But this is where I'll take all of these shapes like this that we've now offset. Let's go ahead and fill it with orange or yellow here. And we'll go ahead and unite these all together. And this is what I'll use with our original shape at top here. And I'll go minus front to kind of get that profile. So this is how I'll build my base artwork, is using this kind of methodology where I look at a shape, deduce it down into a simpler shape, and just make edits on that shape rather than trying to create everything with the pen tool. You really, really don't need to do that. So ultimately, when it's all said and done, all my base vector artwork will look like this on this design. And it's all symmetric. The only ones that aren't symmetric are the ones that kind of cascade over the middle. The nose, I always go in here. Let's zoom in on this. And I always pull a shape over like this, because if I just did it like this at times, Illustrator will want to make a redundant point. So I purposely overlap it so it doesn't do that and it fuses together correctly. And so that's how I create that detail. The chin detail is going to remain kind of like this. So this is where I'll select all of this artwork minus the parts that overlap, like the chin detail, and I'll clone it, Command-C, Command-F. I'll go to the Reflect tool, find a central anchor point like this, hover over it until you see that it says you're on it, click, and then reflect over, and it gives me everything I need. This is where I'll go in and make some adjustments. So if we zoom in on the nose, I'll select the parts on the right like this. Let's go ahead and zoom out like that. We'll go in. I think I got this eyebrow. I probably don't need to worry about this one that much. So I'm going to bring this in. And this looks a little sloppy. It doesn't matter as long as this curve is right. We're just going to bring these in like that. And then these overlaps are fine. So all we have to do now, if we want to fuse these two, all these details are on this side. All these details are on this side. If we unite them together, and now they're one cohesive shape. If I drag it over here, and that's all we're doing. We're going to take the inside part of the skull on this side, the inside part of the skull on that side. We'll unite it together. And then if I drag it over here, you see it's one shape. And we'll do that on the outside curve like this, or the outside profile. And we'll do the bottom left, and right here. All of these, we'll unite them together, and that creates the outline over there. And that's all I'm going to do. I'm also going to take shapes like this skull, or this horn here, and I'll take this horn and I'll clone it, Command-C, Command-F, and just so you can see what I'm doing, I'll color it like this. We'll unite these, and you want to make sure these are a compound path. Now that they are, I'll take this, select the inside part of the skull, and this, you'll want to make sure, right now it's a group, so you want to make sure this is a compound. We'll take the horns, and we're going to minus front because I want this to come in like this. And every time you make a Pathfinder edit, it's going to revert back to a group. I really wish Illustrator didn't work this way. This is why I have a keyboard shortcut set up for F7, so I can just hit F7, turns it back into a compound. Now we can select the outer shape, the outlines, what make up the outlines of the skull, and we can unite those together like that. And you can see this is how we'll go ahead and take the wings here on both sides with the outline. These will also be fused together like this. And this is how you clean up the base art. So when it's all said and done, all we have to do now is colorize it black and white. And this is what we end up with after we reflect it. We can turn off our sketches now down below. So we have all of our black and white shapes. We have the outside perimeter shape, which just sits behind all of these islands of white, whether it's the horns, the face, or the detail and the wings are sitting on top. Now it's at this point that I tend to print something out and just observe it. Approach it again the next day with fresh eyes and determine, is there anything I can improve? And when I did this, I didn't really like how this was looking on the cheek, mainly because if I zoom in, you have this curve that's kind of arching here and going into the side, but then this kind of gives a weird visual, in my opinion. And I thought maybe it just looked better if it just curves all the way up and it wouldn't kind of cause that tension that I see there. So with that in mind, I went back and I edited it to do just that. I also realized that it's going to improve it if I adjust the outline just a little bit, and I did that just so these curves down here look better. And I think that looks a lot better. And this is now where I'll go back in and I'll study like how to round off things. Because right now, if I zoom in, everything comes to this dagger point. So I'm going to turn this on. Notice that all these points that come to a point, watch how it improves it if you just add subtle rounds. You can see all the subtle rounds, especially on the eyes. It gives a shadowing effect here, but all these subtle rounds and elsewhere really improve it. I also thought the overall outline on the skull should improve as well and be a little bit beefier. So if I turn this off and back on again, I think that improves, but I also noticed it kind of pinches this area now, so I knew I had to go back and adjust this, and this is where art directing yourself is vital. Up at the top here, this is kind of causing visual tension. Down here at the bottom, this is kind of filling in and causing visual tension, and I think we can improve that by adjusting the art to give more breathing room into those gapped areas. As I did this, I also looked at the horns and thought, you know, the way we have the shadowing on the eyes is because the light source is coming from the top down, which would cast a shadow there, for there's more dark here. Well, it should be that way under the horns too, because that would cause a shadow. And so I added that as well. So those kind of art directing yourself is really important. Once I get it to this point, this is where I'll physically print out a black and white print and I'll start drawing on top of it. So this shows a printout and me drawing on top of it to work out how I'm going to handle the shading. I only have to do one side. Once again, it's symmetric. I was even thinking of adding some flames. Ultimately, I decided not to add those. But this is how I'll figure out the shading. This is where I'll take it, scan it back in. Once again, using a flatbed scanner, I'll go to transparency. And usually on a print like this, I do about 40%. If you do 15, it tends to be a little lighter. I'll lock the layer and I'll use the same principle to build on top of those drawn shapes to figure out how to pull off the shading and the highlighting. This image on top is a highlight. So when it's all said and done, I have my base art as shown here, and then I have the coloring. I'm going to figure out the tonal family that is, and then I have my shading on top of it. Now, ultimately, the coloring of the base color, this is where I need to establish it, and this is where I'll select this. They didn't want something that was a human skull, And if I colored it white, it's going to look more human. So I decided to color it red like this. I also decided instead of being a stark white, the horns were going to be kind of a off-white color. And on the wings of the bat, I wanted that to be blue. And of course, on his eyes, just to look more monstrous, we're going to color those yellow. And I think this looks good for the base colors. Now, going back to that shading that we built, I figure the color out after I get the black and white out, but I print the black and white out to draw out the shading. Then I build the shading. Then once I have that shading built, this color is not going to work. This is just a gray. I want to show you how I build the shading color, and it starts with the base art. Notice on this color, if I pull this out, this is a transparent blend color, or a shadow color that is, using multiply and 60%. So when it goes over the yellow base color, it creates a nice shading. That's how I did the eye shading here. The same principle applies to the skulls, or the horns, that is, and it's overlapping the base color set to multiply and adjustment opacity to get that nice shading on the horns as well. And we're going to do the same principle on the base of the skull, the base color, which is red. And it starts with selecting the base color. And all we're going to do is we're going to go into the color. And right now, this is the color break. Let's click on CMYK. I always work in CMYK mode. And right now, it's 194. And we want to add some blue to this. So I'm going to add a little bit of blue. We're going to cut the value of the magenta almost in half to 55. And then we're going to cut the value of the yellow from 94, and we'll keep that at 55 as well, like that. And then think in a traditional pigment-based workflow. If you're painting and you wanted to make something darker value and not so saturated, you'd add black to that color value. And that's all we're going to do here is we're going to add an element of black. And I'm going to bring this up to 35%. And you get this muddy color down here. And that's what we want. Let's go ahead and zoom in on this so you can see this up close. This is the value we've created now. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my color palette here. And we can go ahead and drag this color down in here like this. And I'm going to double click on it now. And I always change it to global, and I'll select the name and I'll put nothing in there, and then I'll click OK. So now when I hover over it, it'll give, well, I don't have tooltips on. I normally have that on my workflow. It'll show you the values, so you don't even have to open it up. You can just hover over things. I just turn it off when I record because it makes for a cleaner recording. Now that we have the shading color selected, and set, we're going to go to the transparency palette. We're going to hit multiply. It'll interact with the base color. You can see how it's shading. I think this is a bit too much, so we can go, let's try 85. I think that looks good, setting it for 85. You could even do it 90 if you wanted, but I think 85, we'll try 85 first. Now I'll select the shading. I'll use eyedropper. I'll sample that shading. It'll pick up all those values, and now we have the nice shading, and that's how I create shading values for colors like this. It's the easiest way I've found to do it. This principle will go back to some of the shapes we created from our drawing on top of the printout to create the highlights. You can see how all that works here. Really makes the graphic engaging now. Now, I also continue to art direct myself through the creative process, and I thought these wings were a little too perfect. So I went in and added some wing distress, or just notches in the wing, just to give it a little character. And I really like this. This is where I also go in and I take the time to add the graphic in for the name, thinking about the layout when I pitch the comp for this direction. This is what I send my client. I show it how it works with the type, how you can pull the skull out, how we can create a secondary graphic. And I also take the time to show it this is how it would work on a dark background if you're just wanting a one color version or a two color version in this case without going full color. Now, when they saw this, they loved it. They didn't love the type so much. They wanted the type to kind of harken back to what they had. And we'll discuss that in a little bit. But they said, we're not so sure about the red skull color. It just looks kind of like a demon. It looks cool, but could you try green? And I was like, green? Green's going to be weird. And then when I tried green, I'm like, oh, wow, I kind of like green. I like green better than red now. So it's kind of cool because I would have never tried green. So the client actually pushed me into an area that I probably wouldn't have taken it, but I really liked it once they did. So that's kind of a nice surprise. Now, they said, we want to redo the type, and they sent me this ugly font. Can you just use this font? Well, yeah, I could, but I think I can improve on it. So I took this font, converted it to PAS, laid it out in such a way that made it more custom. But then this is where I took this image, brought it into Adobe Fresco on my iPad, and this is where I just hand lettered it based off of the style they wanted, just so I could control the detailing to work better in the final format. Once I had that, I brought it back to Illustrator. You can see this is nothing but vector art now. I add little artifacts to make it more engaging. This is a lot better than the crude font. And this is how I locked everything up with this design using the new colors. I think this looks great, a lot of fun. And if we turn on this design here, you can see it in a one color format, which works equally as well. Now, you might be asking, well, what happened to the wings? Well, I gave them that as a secondary brand graphic option. So if they ever wanted to do a t-shirt, they could use it for a t-shirts. But if you look at their old cover, which this is one of the ones that they were using, and you compare it to what we came up with for their new cover, you can see how we drastically improved it for them, and they love it. So I just wanted to walk you through this process. It's not always, you never know where something's going to end up with. And I never expected it to be green, but I actually really like it a lot better than the red. I'll admit, I don't get into this genre at all, but creating appropriate art for it is pretty fun. I love creating skulls. Anytime I can work on a skull design, monster related or otherwise, is always an enjoyable creative task for me. If you like this movie, please share a link to my YouTube channel and social media. I'd appreciate it. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe as well. Thank you for watching People Love Process. I hope this content helps you improve your own creative process.